when the ISIS has become a major issue on the table and hosted in an event hosted by another ISIS, which is a better one, let me confess that I personally am officially member of ISIS and differently one, International Society of Iranian Studies. So there are several of these ISIS, and that's why we all don't like the title ISIS for this Islamic movement. We refer to them better IS or whatever, but not ISIS. I'm a student of history. I was trained as an historian, and so I would like to take you away, and I don't know if I want to fly higher, but to combine the larger picture with more focusing on a country that we didn't discuss here today. It's more Iran and Shiite Islam. But let me be more generally. I think over the last 200 years, the Middle East, the Muslim world is engaged in a way, in a quest of a way to combat the challenge of modernism. Everyone who is a good Muslim believes that because Islam is the last of the three religions, monotheistic religions, and because Islam is the last, people who follow Islam are following the better version of monotheistic religion, and therefore they should be more successful, progressive, powerful, rich, enlightened element in human history. They should be the leading force of human history. And Islam, in fact, was a major religion and empires, and Ottoman Empire, Egypt, Iran, the big really countries were very successful. But in the last 200 years, whenever they open their eyes and look around them, they see that there is another power which is more successful. And this is the world of Islam, of Christianity, where they are defeated by militaries from gates of Vienna, the Ottomans. French troops occupied Egypt in few days in the late 18th century. Iran lost territories to Russia in the 19th century. So the three major Muslim countries, Ottoman Empire and Turkey, that emerged out of it with the collapse of the empire, Egypt and Iran found themselves in being on the defense and asking the question, what went wrong in history? Not only that we have the best ideology, in the 20th century we have another asset, we have oil. So if you have the best ideology and you have the best economic tools, why still we are so poor? And the dilemma of the Shiites is even greater, because wherever there are Shiites, there is oil. And they are even less successful economically than the Sunnis. So this raises the dilemma of what went wrong in history. In the last 200 years, we saw the Muslim countries of the Middle East in the search of a way to combat this challenge, looking for new inspirations, directions, and policies. Pan-Islamism, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Turanism, parliamentarism, constitutionalism, nationalism, liberalism, communism less, but even this was suggested by some segments. They tried almost everything, but still the challenge remained. There was no cure to this problem of the domestic malaise of Middle Eastern societies. What happened in the 70s, that there is a new major trend that existed all over. Islam was always in the background. But in the 70s, we see more dynamic version of political Islam, claiming we are not weak because we are Muslim, we are weak because we abandoned true Islam. And they present their version or radical version of what is true Islam. a question over which there is no any agreement even today among Muslims, theologians, and in the politics of the Muslim countries. And here is the peak of this movement in the 70s was the emergence of the Islamic Revolution and creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran with the collapse of the powerful Shah supported by the United States of America within few months. And here is a new attempt. Let's solve the problem not by following the models of the infidels, but rather take our own ideology as a highway to salvation. This ideology gave people, the strength of this dogma was that it gave people hope, and the power of Ayatollah Khomeini and power of other Islamists, so we call them radical Islam, extremist Islam, militant Islam, but all versions of radical interpretations of Islam, is that they are providing people with the hope that the future will be brighter. And today they go on and say the 21st century is the century of Islam. And they don't speak only come to us, as my friend and colleague would say, but they also say we will come to you. And speak about going back to Barcelona and to Rome and other parts of the world. If you look at the map, the first time I saw it when I was in Australia, I saw a map of Islamic movements, and they say what is green on the map in the early 21st century and how the map would look at the end of the 21st century. All the globe will be green. So for believers, and Islam is powerful within the soul and behavior of people of the Muslim communities, this hope bring people, more and more people, to the camp of Islamists. And the slogan is, Islam is the solution. Now, while ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other Islamist movements are seeking to establish their own caliphate or state of power in their communities, what we have already an Islamic state, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And what is interesting to see, to what degree Islam has been the solution and what cures of the Iranian community society this ideology has really managed to solve. Iran would be in 5 days celebrating or marking, I would say, I don't know what is there to celebrate, marking the 36th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. And young people in Iran sit and say, okay, what did we gain? In order to answer the question, what did we gain, you have to ask, what did we dream for? What was the reason that we joined Ayatollah Khomeini, overthrow the Shah, and bring about the Islamic Republic of Iran? I lived in Iran the last 2 years of the Shah, and I saw the people going to the streets. No one will convince me that the dream of the young people of Iran who have overthrown the Shah was to create Islamic Republic. They wish to solve the problem of Iranian society, to give a cure to the main malaise of Iranian problems. It is social justice and political justice. I can narrow it further. What was the dream of the Iranian in 1978 time was to make sure that there is greater welfare, I would say, to provide people with bread and freedom. These are the two main goals of Islamists of Iran at that time. I can add another aim, it is to bring back the dignity of the Muslims, the respect that they deserve. 36 years later, there is no greater freedom in Iran that used to be under the Shah, and the Shah was not a democrat. In fact, I learned to appreciate democracy when I lived first time in my life in a non-democratic country. Only if you live in such a country you understand to value democracy. Is there more democracy today when they're stoning women, when their jails are full of intellectuals, and not only intellectuals, full of clerics as well, that they don't follow the line of of this regime. I used to say that under the Shah, to speak against him or against his regime was a crime. Today, to speak against the regime is a sin, and it's much worse, I would say, than a sin. Is there a greater welfare to the dispossessed, to the weaker strata of society? This revolution was about what they said, the Mustazafin, the weaker strata of Iranian society. Well, the reality is that the rich people became richer and the poor became poorer. Consequently, we learn another thing that we have known all the time, that there is no one interpretation of Islam. No one has the right to claim that they know exactly what is the will of God. And within Iran, there are so many different attitudes. You know, the leading ayatollahs in Iran do not follow Khomeini's dogma. They do not accept that clerics should rule. This is a new phenomenon. Where did you find clerics at the head of government? Saudi Arabia, Shah, Egypt. Well, it used to be in the early days of Islam. And the main point of Iranian Islamism is that clerics should be at the head of government. And there are clerics who will think that politics corrupt. And in better to preserve the status of religion, clerics should distance themselves from politics and not to be leading politics. Ayatollah, this supreme leader, must be a prominent cleric. Why? And there are in Iran different interpretations. Ehud mentioned the gate of ijtihad. It's not a permission to innovate, for God's sake, because innovation is wrong in Islam. It's to reinterpret. And in fact, it's the same thing, but they would never say that's innovation. In Islam, you cannot innovate, and that's one of the problems. If you want to go ahead, you have to look back. Because the source of success, the symbol of success, rests in the past. In Western society, when you speak about the ideal society, you always look in the future, something utopian, something that's never been in existence, and you are striving to achieve it. In Muslim community, when you go to the glorious situation, you always look back. It's like driving fast and looking in the front back mirror. It's very difficult to drive like this when you look back all the time, if at all possible. And the leading Iranian intellectual, one of the supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini, and many of them abandoned this path after a few years, Abdul Karim Soroush, said the following sentence: of course there is one Islam. No one would argue. There is one Islam. This is the Islam that the Prophet Mohamed brought on earth in the 7th century. But, he says, there is no one interpretation of Islam. There is no one interpretation that is better than other. And there is no final interpretation of Islam. And in very courageous way he added, and there can be no official interpretation of Islam. Namely, even an Islamic state, even Islamic Republic of Iran cannot tell you this is the only way to understand this Islam. Because each and every generation has the right to reinterpret, mainly in Shiite Islam, and come with its own conclusion what is good for them. So this struggle continues. Now, what is the challenge that the Muslim community, that Iranian regime brought to us? First is not only Islamic extremism, but it's also the terrorism. It was mentioned before, I don't have to repeat it. Supporting terrorist activists and supporting all kind of, I would say the innovation of the Islamic Republic was this suicide type operation, which is much more difficult to prevent. And creating cells of terror all over the world. And you know it yourself, sitting here. No society, no country is immune from this threat of terrorism. The other one is nuclear issue. And you know, we don't have much time to go into it. The combination of such radical ideology, holding nuclear weapon on the other hand, is something that is totally unacceptable. You cannot allow people with such radical ideology who think that they know best what is good, what is God wants, and the brutality that they use, the way they kill their own children. Why should we believe they will be nicer to us? I don't believe. So what is the hope? The hope is that the Western world will be more sophisticated, capable of understanding the challenge and unifying itself, recognizing its power to combat. The hope is that within the Muslim societies, the silent majority will wake up, because most of the Muslims are not like this. Maybe they should come to the Southeast Asia and learn from your systems, because there are different interpretations, different way to understand Islam. It is important that Europe and allies of the United States will remain with the United States pressuring Iran, because Iran has changed its policy again and again, not voluntarily, but only when it was forced to change its policy. And finally, if I look in the future and see what is the main hope for change in Iran or in the Middle East, I would say the hope is with the young people, with the women. Iran has a wonderful women organization. I mention it often. 60 years ago, there was not a single female student in university. Today, some 65% of the students in the Iranian universities are female. This is irreversible. Education system that develops so fast, with millions of students going to the universities, this is irreversible. It has a challenge. You have to find them jobs. They are not happy. They are dissatisfied. They don't have the power to struggle, because power rests in the hands of the radicals. But if you ask me, for the long run, for the future, this is the hope of change. The Arab Spring was part of it. And I would say that the problem until then is that how you prevent a country like Iran to be nuclear before there is a major domestic change. And unfortunately, the movement of the social political change is much slower than the other trend of nuclearization of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Menashri, and thank you to all three of you, Jonathan Spire, Ehud Ya'ari, and the Professor. Now, this is a lot for us to digest. You've given us strong flavors and impressions of your region. I think that overall, we're talking about, you've spoken both to the ongoing deep tension between Islam and modernity. I think we've seen that manifesting, and its tension has been long-standing, and it has manifested in different ways. In the current phase, in the Islamic State, what we see in the news, or what we are puzzled by in Thailand and the region, is this kind of violence and the news that we see, burning pilots and Jordanian pilots and so on. So we have to bear in mind, keep in mind that this goes back to 2012 from the Arab Spring, but the roots of this tension and clash within Islam, Ehud Ya'ari talk about within Sunni Islam, and then between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, goes back much further, maybe 1,000 years. Okay, let me now turn to our regional speakers in Indonesia, Malaysia, and then Thailand, and then others, and then we'll have an open discussion, 15 minutes each. So a decade ago, we had, after 9/11, the Southeast Asia was seen as a second front. This is a region with the largest Muslim country, but it doesn't have the same kinds of problems and violence that we see in the Middle East. So there's something about what are the fundamental differences in the Islam of Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and so on, And do we have to worry, what are the lessons for the Middle East, perhaps, but also what are the implications from events in the Middle East, from Islamic State and the other insurgent groups for Southeast Asia? 10 years ago, we had this challenge of, after 9/11, Al-Qaeda, the invasion of Iraq, the returning fighters. We had Jemaah Islamiyah here. There's a regional branch of Al-Qaeda. And it was successfully handled, suppressed effectively by Indonesian authorities. And we still have an ongoing remnants. In the Philippines, in Mindanao, there's a framework agreement for a resolution of conflict, but it's not quite settled, and it could still unravel. We had the Aceh peace agreement before. So this is the second round. 10 years ago was the first round. Now we're seeing another round of challenges for the region from the Middle East, and perhaps we can also see what kinds of lessons we could draw from Southeast Asia for Middle Eastern countries. Endi Bayuni, could you please perhaps shed some light?
Thank you, Titinan, and thank you to ISIS Thailand and Chulalongkorn University for inviting me to the campus. It's always good to come back to a campus. Makes me feel young. First of all, I just want to say that in Indonesia, it's more politically correct to refer ISIS rather than IS, because if we say we refer this group in Syria and Iraq as IS, we would give recognition as an Islamic caliphate. And I think we have problems in giving that recognition. I know it's semantics, but it's politically correct to address it as ISIS. But I think in this forum today, in respect of the host, ISIS Thailand, also my friend here, ISIS Malaysia, I will call this IS, not ISIS. Mr. Ya'ari mentioned about Indonesian Muslims, the Muhammadiyah, and Dato Ulama. These are the two Islamic organizations, mainstream, moderate, tolerant, and they're the one that drives the Islam in Indonesia. That we should go to the Middle East before the Middle East comes to Indonesia. Unfortunately, I can say that the Middle East has come to Indonesia, and in this case, IS has already have some representation in Indonesia. I think as early as April last year, there was a report by a very credible think tank run by Sidney Jones, a friend of mine, and they report that there's as many as 200 Indonesian young people have gone to fight with the IS. And then some of them actually subsequently returned to Indonesia and then started the kind of the movement of the IS, organizing meetings and organizing pledges of allegiances. Some at the university, others at the hired conference halls. They were recruiting and getting pledges of allegiance from dozens or hundreds of people. Some even conducted this activity within prisons. I think, fortunately, the government at the time was President Yudhoyono realized that this was a threat to the Indonesian national security, and in August, a little bit late, but I think better late than never, the IS was officially banned in Indonesia, and there have been some arrests of people who have pledged their allegiance, and there have also been a process of enlightening them, even within prisons. Recently, there was a movement, or there was those people who have pledged allegiance to the IS, they denounce that. And part of that because of the government pushing, part of that because of the campaign to open their eyes. Of course, part of that is because of the violence that we are seeing being committed, the brutal violence committed by the IS. The beheadings, including the two journalists, the Japanese journalists last week, and of course the burning of the pilot. So the IS is in Indonesia, but I think the influence has somewhat been contained for a while anyway. But let me just give you a broader picture of where Indonesia sees with regard to the turmoil that has been happening in the Middle East. Indonesia is a country with the largest Muslim population in the world, and almost 90% of the population of 250 million, they are Muslims. So inevitably, whatever happened in the Middle East will have some bearings on Indonesia. We have that emotional, spiritual connection with the region. And of course, we are following closely the politics there, and sadly, there has been one tragedy after another. But then again, I think Middle East has always been in turmoil. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has always been there, and since the 9/11, well, we've had cases of Al Qaeda and the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and of course now expanded to across the whole region, and then we have the IS phenomena. We in Indonesia, I think, Indonesia today is a democracy. In the last 16 or 17 years, which means that all kinds of ideologies, ideas are now open. Yeah, it's an open market place for ideas and ideologies. The only ideology that is officially banned by the government is communism and Marxism, but then it's become irrelevant because communism and Marxism is practically dead. But otherwise, anything goes in Indonesia. And inevitably, there are some people within in Indonesia who are drawn into the idea of Islamic State and the idea of in Indonesia implementing the Sharia. And some of that emanated or were reflected in terms of the militancy or even radicalism or even terrorism that we have seen. But the Islamic militancy or radicalism in Indonesia is as old as the Republic. It has always been there since day one, the moment Indonesia became independent in 1945. It's not a new phenomenon. We have been struggling with this issue. In 1945, Indonesia, we proclaimed our independence, but before we did that, there was a big debate among the founding fathers about, okay, what kind of state are we going to have? And I think that the debate, went for more than 2 weeks. The big issue was whether Indonesia should be an Islamic state or not. And because since Indonesia is a country with the majority of Indonesian Muslims, there was a big, huge pressure for Indonesia to declare the new republic as an Islamic state. But if they had done that, Indonesia would be considerably small than what we have today. Definitely Bali, this is, the republic was not set up because it was still practically a Dutch colony and a Japanese occupation. And during the establishment of the new republic, the founding fathers were trying to bring all the different islands across the former Dutch colony to be part of the new republic. And Bali, which is predominantly Hindu, they were thinking about, should we join a republic that is an Islamic state? Further east to Bali, the pockets of Christians, Catholics, where they are the majority. And they were also asking whether they should join this new republic. So there was eventually there was a consensus. The consensus is that Indonesia is not going to be an Islamic state, but it's a state that recognizes all religions and guarantees freedom of religion and guarantees the right for people of different religions to practice their faith. We would not call ourselves a secular state either, because that would send the wrong message. But it's not an Islamic state. This has been the case, and then those who had wanted Indonesia to become an Islamic state, they accepted it because they realized that otherwise Indonesia would be considerably small. But there were some people who decided no, Indonesia should be, and then they went underground. They launched rebellions and against the state. And this has been the story. The way to deal with, I think, Sukarno and then later Suharto in dealing with this threat from the Islamic groups is to suppress them. And of course, when they suppress them, they suppress all of them. Meaning that there were legitimate voices of Islam, right? They wanted Indonesia to be an Islamic state, but they would fight their way through the political process. Those should be legitimate, but the ones that are not legitimate is when the moment they took up weapons and start terrorizing the people. This has been the case under Suharto. Those voices, many of them were legitimate, were suppressed. Of course, under Suharto was not just the Islamist voices that were suppressed, even the liberal voices were suppressed. That changed in 1998, and now everything comes out, and the voices of those who want Indonesia to be an Islamic state are back. Some of them are fighting through the political system. We have 3 or 4 Islamist political parties contesting the elections, and they have not won the majority, but they have won enough votes to be part of the coalition governments, and they're fighting the causes there. Those, I would say, are legitimate voices. I don't agree with their politics, I don't agree with their causes, but they do represent some people in Indonesia. I would say, like my mother, she has always voted for parties that fight for Islamic State and fight for the Sharia because she believes that's the right thing. But my mother is not a terrorist. She's 84 years old, and that's what she believes. And I have a lot of other friends who also believe that. But I can say that the Islamist political parties are in minorities. They have some support among the population, like my mother, and but their share of the votes have always been in minority. In fact, the best performance they had was actually in 1955, the first ever election, free and fair election Indonesia had. I think since we can discount the elections that Suharto held because they were not real elections, but since 1999 we have had 4 elections that were open to all political parties, including Islamists, and the share of the Islamist votes had been declining since in 1999, and then 2004, 2019, and the last election was actually the smallest. The share of the votes of the Islamist parties was actually the smallest. Now, of course, being in a country with a large Muslim population, we are not immune from what is happening in the Middle East, especially in the last, since 9/11, there was a big debate about Islam, but I think politically, it has been proven that the aspiration for an Islamic state is very small in Indonesia. Although, like I said, it's 90% of the population in Indonesia are Muslims. So majority of Muslims in Indonesia are actually against the idea of an Islamic state. They are also against the idea of the full implementation of the Sharia, because some of the aspects of the Sharia, I think, are universal, and that they are acceptable. Let me see. Well, yeah, and then of course we have had our share of radical Islamism, the tragedy of the Bali bombing in the year 2002, and then there have been other terrorist attacks since then. But I can tell you that I think the government and the police, to their credit, they have done a good job in diffusing the threat of terrorism. The last terrorist attack in Indonesia happened in 2009. That was the twin bombing of the Marriott Hotel and the Ritz-Carlton. Yeah. So Indonesia has been free from terrorist attacks since then. There have been plots, according to police, to attack the parliament building, to even to assassinate President Yudhoyono at the time, but they were foiled. Meaning that I think the police are actually in Indonesia are on top of the situation, and because the capacity have been improved after the Bali bombing. I think they were getting a lot of assistance from Indonesia's friends abroad in improving the capacity of the police in dealing with terrorism, in counter-terrorism as well. They have also improved the intelligence capability, because they have been able to detect the plots of terrorist attacks. Maybe I would say, the terrorist cells are still out there. We have not completely eradicated those. But I think the police are, I would say, like 1 or 2 steps behind the terrorists. So they can settle, they probably can recruit 1 or 2 potential suicide bombers, but never actually be able to carry out the plan because the intelligence in Indonesia were very quick in detecting those and diffuse threats. So in terms of the law enforcement against the threats of Islamic terrorism, Indonesia has done quite a good job. But the real battle in Indonesia is actually in the marketplace of ideas. Indonesia is an open society. People can fight, and then people will say that in the internet there are hundreds of dozens or even thousands of different websites trying to propagate the different kind of Islams. And people choose whatever they find is most suitable to them. And therefore, I think that's going to be the real battle through education, and through the law enforcement. And at the moment, I feel quite comfortable that Indonesia can deal with those threats. Sorry, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Andy, very quickly, Andy, just follow up. You mentioned education, law enforcement. So these are institutions that provide empowerment and voice, and perhaps this is one difference that we can see between Indonesia and the Middle East. And just a quick follow up. Do you think that we could see the reincarnation of a kind of, of Jamaat Islamiyah from radicalized, returning fighters? Could we see that again? What's the likelihood?
I'm sure they're going to try. These people who are returning from Syria, they have been trying. But like I said, I think that the police are already on top of that. The government has already banned the IS ideology. And I'm just going by the track record of the last since Bali bombing. I'm quite confident that Indonesia can deal with this threat quite effectively.
Okay, thank you. Tan Sri Jawhar.
Thank you very much, Coach Titinan. Professor Ek, Dr. Titinan, who kindly invited me to this forum. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's a pleasure indeed to be in the top-ranked university in Thailand, which will be celebrating its centennial in a couple of years, and to be among friends. The topic today is Militant Islam and Middle East Turmoil, Lessons from and Implications for Southeast Asia. So I'm taking this in a macro view to the extent that I understand it, where I stand corrected if my understanding of Middle West Asia, I would like to call Middle East West Asia. We are in Southeast Asia. If my understanding of West Asia is a little bit limited, if my understanding of Indonesia or Thailand is a little bit deficient, I will stand corrected by them. But essentially what I'm looking at is West Asia versus Southeast Asia and what we can learn from each other. And I'll be talking more perhaps about what West Asia can learn from the experience of Southeast Asia. Now in this regard, all my views are personal. In this regard, Southeast Asia itself is in a learning process. We are still learning ourselves, so to teach others. And it's a completely different world. I mean, listening to our West Asian friends speak, it's a completely different world. The dynamics completely different. Southeast Asia is different. I'll come to that later. But we are ourselves in a learning process, and there are some similarities between us and West Asia. We are largely made up of post-colonial countries that are still grappling with state and nation-building challenges, besides striving for a more comfortable life with greater human dignity for our peoples. Some of our states in this region appear to have moved ahead of others in various political, economic, or social fields, but progress sometimes is still tentative and uncertain, and regression or status is a distinct possibility. Since we are talking about turmoil, here the focus is turmoil, If, and therefore the opposite is peace and stability, if achievement of peace and stability in the face of actual or potential instability and turmoil is the issue, particularly in the domestic sphere. Southeast Asian states have arrived at it through different paths. Indonesia and Malaysia, both Muslim majority countries, by the way, have achieved it through democratic and representative government. While others, like Brunei, a Muslim country too, and Vietnam and Laos, which are not Muslim by any means, have for the present achieved it through authoritarian means, for lack of a better term. Southeast Asia, therefore, does not provide uniform lessons for management of peace and turmoil, and the region itself is still in the process of maturing and reform. Nevertheless, Southeast Asia has certainly chalked up a relatively good record of overcoming turmoil and establishing peace both at the domestic and regional levels, and its turbulent past and relatively peaceful present can indeed provide some lessons to other regions that are less fortunate, like West Asia today. In this regard, we must be fully mindful at the same time of the uniqueness of each region, and each country, in fact, within each region, and the difficulty of duplicating the experience of one locality in another. I may sound simplistic when I come to the lessons, but I'm always aware of the fact that we are very different worlds. Our makeup is different, our demography is different, etc. We can go into the details later, but at the same time, we could learn from each other as we can learn from any other region and the world at large. And in this regard, I must point out that like West Asia today, Southeast Asia was in turmoil in the last century, until in fact the concluding decades of the last century. In many respects, the turmoil it experienced was similar to the one that is being experienced and was experienced by West Asia before and now. Like West Asia before, Southeast Asian polities, with the sole exception of Thailand, were colonized and exploited for centuries by European powers. Freedom and independence were eventually won only through wars of liberation or more peaceful agitation and negotiation. As in West Asia too, though our peoples and nations are ancient, our present boundaries and even our constitution as states were heavily influenced by the Western powers. Southeast Asia also has known insurgency and civil war, and some of the countries continue to know insurgency today. But whereas insurgency, civil strife, and interstate conflict in West Asia essentially involves Muslims aside from Israel, and that is giving a negative image of Muslims and even Islam as apparently inherently a violent lot. Insurgency, civil strife, and interstate conflict in Southeast Asia involved Buddhists and Christians as much as it involved Muslims. Many examples: Myanmar, ethnic groups, largely Buddhist, fighting each other. In Thailand itself, CPT, not Muslim. Pulau BRM, Muslim. North and South Vietnam, the war. Cambodian Civil War, Buddhists. In Malaysia itself, Communist Party of Malaysia, not Muslim, so Chinese and Buddhist. And there were some militant groups in Malaysia itself, including Jemaah Islamiyah, groups and all that. And then in the Philippines, we forget, besides the MNLF and MILF, we have the CPP NPA, Communist Party of the Philippines New People's Army, much larger in fact, and longer, not longer, but 4 decades old. And in Indonesia, of course, Pak Andy has already mentioned, we have had PKI and some of the other militant groups. PKI is communist, Muslims, but communist. So this is a very, very thing. And it's so easy to look at things Islam, 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 because we are carried away by IS. So I think Southeast Asia, we have to understand it from a different prism. This is very diverse. There are not only Muslims here, or mainly Muslims here, like in West Asia. This is a very mixed region. But we have undergone the same experiences in terms of insurgency, civil war, etc. And in terms of foreign intervention and domination. We have had European powers and the US in this region, colonizing us for hundreds of years. And we have had an Asian power that invaded and occupied us, and this brutality, if you go to bridge on the River Kwai, over there thousands of civilians brought from various countries in Southeast Asia, and about how many POWs? 11,000, 7,000 POWs are buried there. That was due to that Asian power. So these are very dramatic things, and we must not be carried away by things of the present and forget our past and our context and our environment. This is Southeast Asia. And we don't want, if possible, we have gone through, maybe not to the stark, graphic extent that West Asia is going through now, partly because of technology. You can kill better and faster and more people now than before. But we don't want to become like West Asia again. Now, in terms of, to me, the first lesson we could learn, both sides, is that, now the topic is militant Islam and Middle East turmoil. The first lesson I would learn from Southeast Asia is that militancy, there is no such thing as militant Islam, just as there is no such thing as militant Christianity or militant Judaism or militant Buddhism. But we have Muslims who are militants, certainly. We have Buddhists in Southeast Asia who were militants. We had Christians who were militants. Incidentally, there are many Christians who are militants who wear uniform and fight for a state. They are militants too. So we must not forget there are armed men of all religions, not only Muslims. And to say militant Islam, I think, is misleading. Militant Muslims, yes. And in this regard, we must, to me, it is not the religion. The religion is used and the religion is abused. For the Muslims, it is very common for them to use Islam. Why? Because Islam provides an organizing ideology. Islam says, just like international law, if you are threatened, if your lives are in danger, if your land is being invaded or taken away, for progeny, for your property, you can defend yourself. That is like international law, which means you can defend against external intervention and so on. It's very similar. And like humanitarian law, Islam says you cannot kill civilians, innocent civilians. Just one life. If you take one life, it's like taking the whole of humanity. That is what Islam says. But Muslim groups, they abuse Islam. And they use Islam, and again, I don't want to go into detail what jihad means, etc. We give them great respectability and credence when we call them jihadis. This is what they want to be known as, jihadis. Whereas actually, many of them are thugs and murderers. So I think we should be careful about all this, being carried away by all these catchwords. And here, I would also say that these Muslims, wherever in this region especially, where a religion like Islam is the brand, as opposed to say it can be communism, CPM, Communist Party of Malaysia, or wherever in Southeast Asia, anywhere in the other world, sometimes they fight as communists. Sometimes they fight for a nationalist cause. Sometimes they fight for an ethnic group, whatever, in southern Thailand or southern Philippines, or religious group. But it can be for any cause. And for some of the Muslim groups, not all, it can be for religion. And you have to go behind religion, behind all these things to find out what really they are fighting for. What are the people in Syria fighting for? What are the people in Iraq fighting for? So I think we have to go beyond this. And when we go beyond this, there are political reasons why they are fighting. There are socio-economic roots of their struggle. And this is what we have to look for, because otherwise it will be misleading. And when we mislead the terms we use and the assumptions we make, then the prescriptions we make will also be terribly misleading and destructive. And this is what I think is happening too much nowadays. Now, the second lesson for me is that peace, and I'm talking about Southeast Asia, peace and stability, this is from experience, can be achieved in both an authoritarian or democratic governance setting. In authoritarian setting, the governing authority, and this can be a hereditary or dynastic ruler, has to be benign, practice good governance, and work for the well-being of the people. Brunei is an example. It is not democratic. It is one of the most authoritarian states. But I think it practices good governance, benevolence. That is why it can be there for such a long time. Such ruling authorities can sometimes govern with a firm and sometimes harsh hand, often restricting civilian and political rights. But they are accepted and supported by the people because there is otherwise good governance and peace in the country. But in the long run, this is my view, for sustainable peace, government should perhaps be by the consent and with the participation of the people, like in Indonesia and I believe Malaysia. But this is the difficult process when you transit from authoritarian to democratic. The transition from authoritarian to democratic rule is always a difficult and often a painful one. Europe is one of the best examples. The blood and gore of the French Revolution and elsewhere, we don't want that. So this transition is very painful, not only in Muslim countries, West Asia, Southeast Asia, everywhere. It's not an Asian phenomenon, it's very much European too. And change is best, to me, driven from the top. But this is hopeful, of course. Example, Thailand, with constitutional monarchy at one time. Of course, things can be different now. And also it is best incremental and organic and best from within. Sometimes, however, we need people power to push. And I'm talking from not only regional experience, elsewhere too. We need people power, and it becomes a factor. You cannot just rely on reform from the top. In such situations, the least desirable, and I'm choosing the word carefully, least desirable option is to leave it to the domestic players to act out the situation. If external powers are involved, they must at best play a supportive role without giving overt support to any party except the party in power if it is undertaking reform. There should be no meddling in internal affairs except when the international community, represented by the United Nations, is satisfied that the situation is beyond control and anarchy is likely. Intervention should be strictly in accordance with R2P principles, responsibility to protect principles. And any abuse of these principles, as was done in Libya, should be severely punished by the UN and appropriate bodies such as the International Criminal Court. I'm talking about Southeast Asia. We don't want this to happen in Southeast Asia. There should be no forcible regime change. In our case, for instance, in Cambodia, our experience, we could not have the Khmer Rouge, when the Vietnam invaded Cambodia, they established this Heng Samrin regime. We could not just get rid of that regime, but we could not have Khmer Rouge back because it did not have international credibility, legitimacy. It was such an evil regime. Incidentally, Khmer Rouge was Buddhist, not Muslim. One of the most evil regimes on earth. Millions died. They lost their homes, their lands. They were not Muslim. But let's be alive to all these things. And what is the reason? We'll have to go back, yeah? And they were perhaps as evil or more evil than the Islamic State. We don't want, and that is Southeast Asia too. So in this case, what Southeast Asia did, we had some good people then, capable people with vision, wisdom. They established a third force, something the international community could support, not the Khmer Rouge, not the regime in Phnom Penh that was installed by a foreign invasion force, but a third one. They built this thing up which was more acceptable to the international regime, which was the Democratic Government of Cambodia, CGDK, Coalition Government of Democratic Cambodia, which included Sihanouk, etc. This is how they brought about a political resolution to the problem, not regime change. Now, lesson number 3, attempts at regime change by force from the outside should be strongly condemned and penalized, whoever the perpetrators are. They cause untold damage and suffering to human life, property, and national assets, including your culture, civilization, your museum, etc. They then declare victory and walk away, leaving only further death and destruction and rubble behind them when their clumsy attempts at fostering a stable, apparently, they want a stable and democratic government. When they fail, they just walk away. Syria today, you have at least 3 million refugees. 200,000 people have been killed. Of them, almost 25,000 are women and children. Now, these are not only by external powers, it's internal, It's by the Assad government, I would like to use that word, Assad government. It's by the rebels. It's by all those who are supported by outside powers in the region, as well as from outside. So we don't want that kind of thing. Not in Southeast Asia, not again. So we think that these powers, they cause much great agony, death, and destruction than sometimes any terrorist organization. If you look at some of the, I don't have to mention names, invasion and occupation, how many people did they kill? How many people did they burn? We mentioned about IS burning. How many people did they got burnt by bombs and chemicals like phosphorus? So we should, and these leave scars for generations. You create the next generation of militants and terrorists. Next lesson, I think, we should nurture, the fourth lesson, a cohesive and resilient nation state. I'm talking from regional Malaysian experience, some other experiences. Southeast Asian states must ensure, and perhaps West Asia too, that their governments are fully supported by the people and the citizens are not divided against each other. The sad thing about East Asia is they are divided against each other. Country versus country, sect versus sect, tribe versus tribe. Depending on the country concerned, this means government that is representative, inclusive. What happened in Syria, what happened in Iraq, etc., or Libya, not inclusive. Inclusive, inspired by and responsive to the legitimate needs and aspirations of the people, a government that recognizes and protects the rights of all communities, including minorities, and a government that is able to deliver on peace, law, and order. There must also be a strong sense of nationalism and patriotism built on love for the country and not to bring in outsiders. Shared vision of the future, I don't want to develop. Fifth, I must go quickly. Develop in Southeast Asia. What we have over the years developed is good and peaceful relations with our neighbors. We were once in conflict with one another. Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, etc. We were once in conflict with one another. But today, we have developed peaceful, constructive relations. I think this is very important if you want to have avoid turmoil, the word turmoil in the West Asia. Second, we also develop, of course, this regional organization is not as strong as in some as EU or whatever, but an ASEAN, an association of Southeast Asian nations, which has given a degree of stability, peace, commonness, and this year, to some extent, we are celebrating an ASEAN community. Of course, there won't be one, but to a large extent, we are bringing people, nations, countries together to live in peace and sort out our problems. We have disputes, we have conflicts. Malaysia and Indonesia, we still have some of our territorial disputes, etc., but we manage it peacefully. Next, and for us in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, we have this thing where we try normative, and some of us, of course, are forced by circumstances to ally ourselves with some outside powers. We try as far as possible not to ally ourselves with outside powers. We try as far as possible to be friends with all. We are friends with China, we are friends with the US, we are friends with everybody, and not take sides against each other. But sometimes, because of territorial conflicts, Philippines may need a little bit of help, etc. But it must be proportionate, not over the board. 7, I think, if we want to this, we have to resolve the Palestinian issue. That Palestinian issue is having momentous impact not only in Southeast Asia, but in many other parts of the world. And that solution, of course, must be based on international law, UN resolutions, etc. Lesson number 8, don't worry, I'm not going to dwell on that. Lesson number 8, I think we must, as citizens, people, read and listen to and view alternative media. Read and listen to alternative narratives in order to get a broader, balanced understanding. Now, I can go to implications. I don't want to talk so much about IS. My friends have already talked about IS. As far as Malaysia is concerned, it has condemned IS. It considers it a serious problem. We are looking at people who have left. Incidentally, there are 70 people who have left, and another 10 or 20 who have been prevented from leaving to join Syria. We are worried that if they come, they may cause some conflicts, etc. But to put things in perspective, that is not our biggest problem. The IS is not our biggest problem. Our biggest problem in Malaysia, for instance, is fostering national unity, bringing together people of different ethnic and religious and territorial backgrounds, Sabah, Sarawak, etc. together. That has been our first and most fundamental problem. It remains our first and foremost problem. IS is a very distant second or third problem, and that is because there are no other problems in between, generally. Eastern Sabah is one of them. So I think I would like to stop there, and thank you.